All right, well, welcome to Northwestern Voices, Robin Fish. Robin, you are a reporter, or I should say maybe the reporter. No, a reporter.
A reporter.
At the Park Rapids Enterprise here in Park Rapids, Minnesota. Mm-hmm. You've had a very interesting life that's led you to this point. And I think you were originally born in Las Vegas.
Yes.
And
I was an Air Force brat.
An Air Force brat. And you went to, what was it? You said 13 different schools or something?
Right. Counting pre-kindergarten, I went to 13 schools before I graduated from high school.
So, what are some of the highlights?
Well, I think maybe the highlight is 6th grade for me, where I attended 3 different schools in 1 year. Because they were all in different states. So, and that was the year my parents had split up over the summer, and there was my mom moved to another state, and my dad got a job in another state, and then custody changed hands and so forth. So it was a stressful year for a couple of brothers.
So it was difficult enough, I would assume, being in a military family and all the moving, but then after your parents split up, that probably doubled it in a way.
Yeah, somewhat. Plus, actually, my dad hadn't been in the military all the time. That was just around the time I was born. Mm-hmm. But my brother and I came along, and then he finished his stint in the Air Force, and he went to school to become a pastor, and he's a Lutheran pastor now.
He currently is?
Yes.
Okay.
Yep.
So were these schools basically from coast to coast, or any central location? Or
a lot of them were around the Midwest, Indiana, Nebraska, Minnesota, one in Iowa, mm-hmm. and that pretty much covers where my schools were. But we moved from town to town, and as a pastor, my dad moved from one church to another, across state lines and everything. And then, like you said, with my parents splitting up and living in different states, there was a lot of going back and forth, and
mm-hmm.
And so by the time I finished high school, I was in Crosby, Minnesota.
Yep.
I went to Crosby Ironton High
mm-hmm.
from the middle of 10th grade until I graduated.
So what kind of skills did you learn, or what kind of lessons did you learn from all that moving around? I mean, I would imagine that, so you roll into a new school the first time and you're the new kid, mm-hmm. and then you're the new kid again, and then you're the new kid again. And then I would imagine that at some point you start to realize what you need to do as far as being the new kid.
I don't know. I don't think I really tried hard to make friends or mm-hmm. to get a group of friends around me. I just sort of tended to, people were nice,
Yeah.
And I usually found people to be pretty welcoming when I was the new kid. And so it was never really hard to have friends for me. But mm-hmm. But I also learned to be kind of self-contained and not to rely on anybody, outside of my home, outside of my immediate family, to be there, to have my back. I just kind of took care of myself.
Mm-hmm. I'm sure that it helped your sort of independence or independent living skills or something in some way, right?
Yeah, I definitely think so. And maybe I haven't been as socially outgoing as a lot of people. I didn't go to a lot of parties and that kind of thing, but mm-hmm. but I was, as soon as I was old enough to work, I had a job, and most of the people I saw, I either saw them at school or at work when I was, whatever job I had.
Mm-hmm. And then you went to seminary.
Yes.
Was that right out of high school, or did
right
you?
out of college?
Okay,
yeah.
Where'd you go to college?
I went to Bethany Lutheran College in Mankato, and Mankato State. At the time, Bethany was a 2-year school,
mm-hmm.
so I got my associates there, and I majored in music in college at Mankato State.
Okay.
And I was interested in journalism from an early age. I loved writing. I always had a tablet and pens and was scribbling stories and poems and mm-hmm. things like that. And I even, I think in 5th grade, I co-edited the classroom newspaper.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So I always was interested in journalism, and I thought about it as a career, but I majored in music knowing that I was going to go to the seminary and study to be a pastor.
Where did you go to seminary?
Concordia Theological Seminary in Fort Wayne, Indiana.
Concordia, okay.
So that's a Missouri Synod Lutheran seminary, and I graduated from there in, this will date me, 2000.
Okay.
And, with an MDiv. And I served as a pastor in a couple of places, one of them in the Kansas City area,
Yep.
and the other in Yuma, Arizona.
Uh-huh.
And that's where I resigned from the ministry.
And so you were ordained as a pastor in the Missouri Synod.
Yes.
Okay. I'll just ask you a couple of real easy questions, just because I think that about religion. Because normally I don't ask people questions about religion unless they're a pastor. Just like I wouldn't ask somebody about politics unless they were a politician, because I think a lot of the times our some of the theological stuff shapes our worldview. But I'm not asking you to expound on these at all. But do you take more of a Calvinist or an Arminian worldview?
No. The Lutheran confession kind of steers between those as like two ditches that you can fall into, and we like to stay up on the road. So
okay.
We don't, for example, when it comes to election, we don't believe in double predestination. You know that there's a eternal decree that certain people are going to go to hell.
Right.
But we do believe that everybody is by nature sinful, and that we are redeemed by Jesus Christ, his atoning sacrifice, and that forgiveness is presented to the sinful human race and appropriated by faith.
So it's about a choice a person would make.
I don't think we would put it that way. I think we would like to say that God chooses us, and this is biblical. You did not choose me; I chose you. Thing that if it is not by, I think I'm going back to right at the beginning of the Gospel of John. It is not by human will or the blood of man, but by the will of God, and. That Martin Luther famously wrote a book called The Bondage of the Will, that the bound will, that the idea that we have freedom to choose is kind of an illusion, built right into our human nature from the fall of Adam and Eve is alienation from God. And so he brings us to him. He calls us to him. He uses his word to change us, to make what was not into what is.
And then views on eschatology. Being a reporter, I would think, well, your views on the end of the world. Will there be a literal 1,000-year reign of Jesus Christ on earth, or where do you stand on that question?
No, I think the testimony of Scripture is pretty clear that no one knows the day or the hour, not even the Son, according to Jesus. That we have to always be on the alert for the trumpet to sound, and the last day to come when Christ will return. We don't know when that's going to be.
Okay.
And it's when he comes, he will raise all the dead, and those who have been those who are being saved will be raised to eternal life, body and soul, in the new heavens and earth.
All right.
And then that's it. It is appointed for man to die once, and then comes the resurrection.
So you were a Lutheran pastor at two different congregations, and then at some point you decided on a change of career. When was that?
That would be about this time in 2005, and I was down in Yuma, Arizona, and I was kind of worn down by church politics, toxic politics in the congregation.
Yeah. That can be really discouraging.
Yeah. So I resigned from the parish. I was still on the clergy roster for several years, but I, would do a little guest preaching now and then to fill in for a pastor who was on vacation or called up for active duty or whatever. But I worked in other fields. I did a little bit of case managing of the mentally ill for a little bit.
This is still down in Arizona?
This is still in Arizona. Probably less than a year, just almost a year doing that. And it gave me a lot of insight into mental illness issues and the need there is for, many people aren't receiving the care that they deserve, that they have a right to. And so it kind of put that on my conscience. But also I worked for a Christian magazine, Lutheran magazine called Good News in the St. Louis area for a number of years. And I was the secretary to the editor, and I did a little bit of page design work, and I worked in the distribution, like the foreign distribution for a while, and then just, domestic and foreign distribution. So people had subscriptions. I was taking their payments and stuff, like maintaining the database and what have you. And that magazine is still going, kind of comes out on an irregular basis. But it was are you familiar with the program, the Lutheran Hour? It's a radio program.
Is that also out of the St. Louis area? I think
Yeah,
I have heard of it before. Yes.
Lutheran Hour Ministries. It's run by an outfit called Lutheran Laymen's League, and one of their associate speakers, Wallace Schultz, is the editor of Good News magazine, and he started it back, I believe, in the 90s when the Soviet Union was falling apart, and churches that had been driven underground were coming back out into the sunlight, and he saw a need for them to have teaching materials so that they could start over without pastors and maybe teach themselves, or as they started to have pastors, so they'd have a little bit of basic doctrinal material that they could look at and teach to their congregation
in their own language.
So the original Good News was originally published in Russian and I think Ukrainian, and then it moved up. Of course, there was an English version so that people in this country could see what the concept was and what was being taught, and ended up really taking off in English. And it's now been translated into at least 20 different languages.
And is it a monthly publication?
No, it's just whenever they pull an issue together. Okay. And sometimes it might even be years between issues anymore. It used to be about 3 times a year.
I want to go back to what you said about mental health. Do you feel as though in our country or in our area, if you don't know, do you feel like we're in a state of declining mental health?
I wouldn't say that. I would say that there's always about the same percentage of people who have mental health issues. I think a lot of people live with undiagnosed mental health issues, and that kind of weighs on them, and that they either just suffer in silence or they self-medicate, and that leads to a lot of substance abuse issues. Or maybe it's people keep it very private because there's a stigma, and in maybe some lines of work, having a mental health diagnosis or being on psychiatric meds can be detrimental to your career. For example, if you're an airline pilot, there's such a stigma of mental illness or being on psychiatric drugs that some people who suffer from mental illness in the aviation industry keep it under their hat, so to speak.
Which isn't a good thing.
No. There was a case not too long ago. I can't remember exactly when.
Was that the pilot that took mushrooms or whatever?
Yeah, the pilot. He took mushrooms. just one time, and he suffered like a psychiatric break. And,
Right.
And he was in the cockpit as a guest. He wasn't flying the airplane, but I think he was.
Because he was a pilot,
Yeah,
he
was.
had that
They call
courtesy.
it was like a jump seat thing. The plane was full. They didn't have a seat for him in the passenger cabin, so he was sitting in the cockpit jump seat. And all of a sudden, in the middle of the flight, he reached a point in his struggle with reality that he tried to shut down the engines.
Yeah.
And they ended up having to subdue him and drag him out of the cockpit and lock the door. It didn't end up endangering anyone's life, but he was in that position partly, and there's other cases too, where pilots find themselves in a position where they need treatment or they're receiving treatment, but they have to keep it a secret because that would be the end of their career.
Right.
Or it would put their career on hold for a long time, and it's difficult to get back into the cockpit.
I think that's true, especially for pilots. I mean, there are other professions I can think of off the top of my head, maybe being like, say, law enforcement or something like that too, where you would probably try to, or not try to, but it would be important to minimize, any external knowledge of a mental health problem, because for fear of the fact that you could lose your job. I mean, any job where you're responsible for the lives of others, or in the case of a police officer carrying deadly force and being put in harm's way, and having to make that split second judgment about whether to squeeze the trigger or not, you'll be scrutinized if you have these types of issues. And so they would, of course, I'm not saying people are being purposefully deceptive, but I guess my question was more about was whether you felt as though we are seeing more and more cases of mental illness, or any particular kind of mental illness, as time goes on. I guess, but I think you kind of answered it. So you think it's kind of been steady going all, from the dawn of time all the way to today, or if you felt. Because what I've seen, and my experience has sort of been that I kind of feel like it's on the rise, or at least certain types of mental illness or mental health issues are kind of on the rise. But
I don't know. I have to look at numbers and figures on that to be sure.
Yeah.
But it seems to me that there's just a certain amount of the population in every way you slice society, in all walks of life. There's going to be a certain proportion of people who are suffering from some kind of mental illness. And it could be the ministry, it could be the legal profession, or the medical professions, and maybe some circumstances in people's lives are getting them down, or in a lot of cases, I think substance abuse is probably on the rise. I think that's becoming a serious problem. It's getting worse and worse. More and more people are being affected. Hardly anyone doesn't know somebody or isn't close to somebody who has a substance abuse disorder or substance use disorder, and that's something that kind of plays into mental health as well, because there's
sort of a chicken or egg type of thing, right? It's you have a substance use problem because you were self-medicating for a mental health issue an undiagnosed mental health issue, or did the substance itself cause the mental health issue?
Yeah. Or just how the behavioral problems, whether it's substance abuse or mental health issues, kind of sometimes look the same.
Yeah.
And you end up having people with overlapping
the dual diagnosis.
issues. Dual diagnosis.
Right. All right. So then jumping back, so after you left the publication, then you started working more just in terms of a reporter, or how did that transition work?
Well, I had been let go from the magazine. Their funding was kind of going down, and I was one of the last employees they let go. And so I was doing some sales and marketing around the St. Louis area where I lived at the time. And my dad is a pastor. He was serving a congregation in the Lake of the Ozarks area in Missouri, and he wasn't getting a salary from being a pastor. The congregation was very small and struggling financially, so to to make ends meet, he was getting side jobs. And at one point, he got a job as the editor of one of the local small town newspapers in Versailles, Missouri. You're gonna hate how I pronounce that.
It
looks like Versailles.
Versailles, right?
It's
but
Versailles.
They say it Versailles, and that's how it's pronounced.
That's for sure. And he they had two newspapers coming out of that office, and the other one was for the neighboring town of Stover, and they had a vacancy open up for editor of the Stover paper, and he got in touch with me and said, "Why don't you submit your resume?" And I ended up getting the job, and in August, beginning of August of 2014, we became the editor of the Morgan County Press in Stover, Missouri.
Yeah.
And the office, sorry, I banged into the microphone.
That's okay.
The office of the Stover paper was actually in Versailles, and it was a town of about 1,000 people. It had the coverage area extended into a few nearby communities, really small towns, a very old historic southern Missouri town called Florence, where they had some kind of fracas during the Civil War, and they have a little metal plug in the seat from the U.S. office of something or other that
Missouri was a slave state.
It was a slave. Well, it was a slave state, but it was not a Confederate state.
Okay.
But there were groups from both sides of the war, not necessarily regular army, but like irregulars, chasing each other around the countryside. And there was a rump state government. It was an interesting era. They had a Confederate governor and they had a Union governor kind of thing, but the state never seceded from the Union. And so they have some colorful history, and I got to I really came to enjoy working in journalism, working as a small town reporter. I went to everything. I was present at everything that happened in town. I wanted to take pictures of everything that was happening and talk to everybody who was doing anything, and I think it really helped the community. That I think they felt that the local newspaper was one of the things that helped the community thrive and succeed in its small, rural way.
A lot to unpack there, but what's your definition of journalism?
Well, that's a big word, but I think it's basically news. You're reporting the news, and you're kind of creating a public record of the history of the town as it unfolds, and you're telling people what they need to know about what's going on in their community. And sometimes it's routine stuff like, the city council meeting and the school board meeting are open meetings. Anybody in the public can go to them. But for a lot of people, they know what's going on through the newspaper because they don't go to those meetings in person. So your journalist is the guy or gal who's attending those meetings in person, sort of on behalf of the whole community, and then tells you what happened or shows you in pictures.
Are there ethical rules when it comes to journalism?
Oh yes, definitely there are.
What are some of those? Maybe some of the more important ones.
Well, one that has come up in the last few years and was right in our face was that you don't publicize disinformation or misinformation. And there's a lot of other ones that I was trained in when I first started as a reporter. My publisher put me through a great big thick binder of training material before he would trust me on on the road myself. But things like you don't misrepresent yourself, you don't you don't break the law to get into a location where you want to do coverage. You don't you you respect people's choice whether or not they want to be photographed, you know. So if I come up to somebody, I want to shoot your picture. Is it okay if I shoot your picture? If they say no, I don't. You endeavor to be accurate. And of course we publish corrections all the time because mistakes are made. Sometimes just typos. Sometimes you misunderstood the information that you were presented, and then somebody clarifies it, and then you have to issue a correction because you got it wrong the first time. But you do your best to put out truthful, accurate information.
Who ultimately makes the decision as to whether something is disinformation or misinformation or the truth?
Well, I guess it's a publisher's and editor's, more on the publisher. But and I don't want to slander someone or to identify someone, but there's been a case in Park Rapids since I've been here where somebody stood up at a meeting and disinformation came out of their mouth. Actually, it's happened multiple times. And,
what is disinformation?
It's different. Disinformation. Well, there's misinformation and disinformation, and misinformation is just when when they're telling you something that just ain't so. And
intentionally, or does it have to do with
disinformation? I think is more intentional.
Okay.
So misinformation is
just somebody's got it wrong.
Somebody's got the facts wrong,
right.
And they're publicizing something that isn't right, that isn't correct. And you can fact check things. You can go to the experts. And I'll give you, for instance, it had to do with COVID-19 protocols and what was medically appropriate, what the statistics showed, what clinical studies were showing to be the truth. And somebody got up at a meeting and rattled off a bunch of information, and we took it to the county or the community health people, like CHI St. Joseph's Health, Community Health, and said, can you tell us how accurate this is? Is there anything in here that we should clarify, or any errors that we should correct? So we're not just putting out misinformation or disinformation, and my I guess naive instinct would have been, I'm at this meeting and I'm writing about what happened, and I'm going to report what people said, and so said this, and so said this, and so said that. But journalistic ethics says that if you can back that up, or if you can debunk it, if what they're saying is untrue, then get a source for that. So we went to CHI St. Joseph Community Health, and they exploded a whole bunch of the information this person had given at this meeting. And they weren't happy about it. That person has responded on a couple of occasions that they felt that we violated their freedom of the press. And this is something I think people need to understand, that if you want to exercise the freedom of the press, you've got to have a press.
Yeah, I was going to say, that doesn't sound right. I don't think individuals have the freedom of the press.
No.
The press has the freedom.
Yeah, the freedom of the press doesn't give you the right to put anything you want to say in the newspaper and not have it challenged.
The First Amendment would allow a person to speak.
Yeah, but we don't have to report what they said.
Right.
Or we don't have to report what they said and not ask someone else to give their point of view, or to ask an expert to tell us the facts.
Isn't it that the case though that sometimes a lot of the cynicism that comes into this is because people don't trust the fact checkers, and they say, well, an article was written, they said what I said was disinformation, but I say that what they said about my disinformation was in fact disinformation. and here's some more disinformation, or here's some information that shows that their fact check of my story is actually disinformation. And then so where does it stop?
I don't know. I think people. You ultimately have to.
And I'm not talking about that particular case. I'm just saying hypothetically speaking.
I think my mind is just teeming with possible examples, but I think there's just a point where you just have to put out what you've got and leave it up to people to make up their own mind.
Right.
That you do your best to make your case, and people have to make up their own mind.
Yeah.
And that you're never going to convince somebody who is just ardently committed to what they believe. If you're gonna, and there is a point past which you just don't even go there. You're not even going to engage. I mean, sometimes just because somebody gets up and speaks at a meeting, we don't have to say anything about it.
That may not be newsworthy.
It may not. Yeah, it's like I don't think I'm going to write about this. It's not news. And
because you're not a stenographer that's there like or court reporter like taking down every word that's said and then publishing like a word for word transcript.
Yeah, if you look at like my coverage of the school board or city council, you're going to see a lot of things reduced to just a bullet point, because so many decisions are made and not even discussed at the meeting. They're just in a list of consent items, and you have to page through this thick binder of backup information, the packet, to find out what the information, what's in the background of this item in the agenda. But and sometimes there's pages and pages of it, and it's boring. And you do want to think though, like, what is the government spending money on? I think the taxpayer wants to know.
Yeah.
So I think it merits a bullet point if they spend $10,000 on something or $5,000 on something. That I'll just mention it in a one-line bullet and leave it at that. But if it's something where there's controversy and they're discussing it, then that discussion gets into the story. But there's a limit to how much space you have. Yeah. So you have to be you have to use your judgment about how much detail to go into, how deep to dive into it, and you're going to end up leaving a lot of things out just because of space considerations. You just have to prioritize what's important.
Yeah. Well, I suppose you've also got time considerations too, deadlines and things like that.
For sure. Our Park Rapids Enterprise comes out twice a week. We do have a website where things could be posted any time during the week, but for our print product, we've got to have everything ready to go by a certain time every Monday and every Thursday, and because that's when the pages are being put together, and the paper is going to press at a certain time. And we've had a couple of times when we've had to strain deadlines. Folks in the area might remember a few years ago there was a shooting that ended the lives of 3 people in our area over by Nevis. Mm-hmm. And the fact that this had happened crossed our desk sometime on Monday. We're working on our deadline for our Wednesday issue, and all of a sudden, breaking news. And page designers are breathing down our neck. When are you going to have this ready? What are you like? Give us a minute. The news is coming out as we speak. So sometimes deadlines do have to be bent a little bit, but for the most part, if I go to a school board meeting on Monday evening, I'm going to have pretty much all the material I need to write the story, and I'm going to do it on Tuesday morning. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And if I go to a city council meeting on Tuesday evening, I'm going to write that sucker on Wednesday morning. Even though my deadline isn't until Thursday afternoon, I'm going to get it done.
Do you work long hours?
I'm a 40-hour-a-week person. My editor, Shannon Geisen, is on salary, so she could potentially work very long hours. And there have been a few times when I've kind of sat in for her when she was out of town for one reason or another, and I had a taste of, it's a big job. Editing that newspaper is a big job, and I don't envy her it. The times I've filled in for her, I understood how very time-consuming it is, and how much work you have to squeeze into the time available.
Does it have a greater circulation than, say, like a Versailles, Missouri?
Yeah. For sure. Yeah. I think, just looking at the size of the community, I think if you put Versailles and Stover, Missouri together, you probably have less people than Park Rapids has.
So what brought you to Park Rapids then?
I had been. I mentioned that my father wrote for the Versailles paper when I was working for the Stover paper, and we had the same publisher. And he was in the Missouri Synod in Lutheran Church. We call it receiving a call.
Yeah. But
he was invited to be the pastor at a church up here in Verndale.
Oh, yeah.
Or near Verndale. And so he accepted that call and moved up here, and then I was left high and dry in Missouri all by myself. And all my family's up, almost all of my family is up in this area.
Yeah.
And we're somewhere in Minnesota.
Yeah.
And I have a brother in the Twin Cities area.
Me too.
And so, yeah. And, aunts and uncles and so forth. So pretty much my whole family's from Minnesota. And I was all by myself down in Missouri. Nobody else close to me.
Yeah.
So I looked for a job.
It was a logical move then for you to look for a job.
I looked for a job up here. I actually applied to 3 different newspapers, all in the forum communication family. And I interviewed for them one day after another, bang, bang, bang. And there was nothing between me and my publisher's office except a thin wall of of wood veneer paneling. And I'm eternally surprised he didn't hear these interviews going on from his office. I would close the door, I'd get on the phone, have these interviews, and 2 of them got back to me and said, we decided to go in another direction. And I didn't hear back from the Park Rapids Enterprise for a long time. And I guess they were just slammed. They were so busy at that time. And I was, they're going to turn me down. But I ended up getting the offer and moved up here.
Was that when Luann was still the editor, or was it somebody else?
No, Shannon was the editor.
Shannon was. Okay.
Then it was in January of 2018.
Okay, because we just had Luann on the podcast. That's why. Yeah.
Yep. So I never actually worked with Luann at the newspaper, and they had. I guess there'd been some turnover on their writing staff because our other news reporter, Lori Scarpness, was hired just a little bit before I was. And so I think we kind of got the dream team. So between us, we cover, I guess, our coverage area. Shannon focuses on the county board and Monaga City and School. My beat is the Park Rapids City Council and School Board, and Lori covers Nevis and Akeley.
Who handles the sports stories?
That's Vance Carlson. He's been with the newspaper for 30-some years now, 36 years, I think. And he does a great job. Right now, Shannon and our ad rep, Kelly Hookey, there's bad grammar there. Little red line through that.
Something to avoid.
Are at the M&A convention in the Twin Cities. And that's the Minnesota Newspaper Association. Oh. And they just collected a fistful of awards, and 2 of them are for Vance. He won in our newspaper's weight class. He won a first place award for news photo and I can't remember if it's second or third for a sports photo, and a second or third place award for a sports feature story. I think a third place. He did a feature story about some local people who went to a historic Vikings game, and so I think that's what won for him.
So, is there like, do you all kind of share the, I don't know what you call it, the crime beat or the, law and justice, or what do you, or is that more of your focus or somebody else's?
It's somewhat shared. I do a lot of the typesetting for the Hubbard County incidents, which usually twice a week, we get a kind of police blotter from the sheriff's office.
Oh, so they send that to you.
They send that to us, and I just kind of cut it down into paragraph form. I reword it so the sentences make sense, and I look up on the GIS map, what township such and such happened in, so I don't have to overly closely identify where it happened. Otherwise, people might feel like we were identifying them personally.
Yeah.
And we also have a court report, Hubbard County court report. It comes out from time to time with felony charges, and Shannon has been putting that together lately, and a few other things.
So, aside from your coverage of school board and you said city council, right?
Yeah.
Was it those two? You obviously write other stories too. So how do you go about finding stories, or how does that process work?
A lot of it is people come to us, and either they'll say, I want you to do a story about me, or I know somebody that has an interesting story to tell. Why don't you talk to them?
Yeah.
And we reach out and try to schedule an interview, get some pictures, and we have a couple of series of stories that we're doing. One of them is called Making Minnesota Memories, where we're trying to we just invite people to suggest, what kind of story could we do about the tourism industry in the area, or the resorts. Do you have memories of the good old days at such and such resort?
Oh, I'm sure you've talked to Ren Holland about that.
Yeah, I did a story about the Val Chattel ski resort.
Oh, yeah. Which is now being turned into
Deep Lake
Deep
Park,
Lake, yeah.
yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And I think there's a resort out by Two Inlets, on Two Inlets Lake that I did. Other people have suggested other places, and you just try to talk to the owners or the family that previously owned the place, and they'll tell you, what it was like in the 60s, or how they got started and where it's gone from there. Sometimes another series we do is called Where Are They Now? And that's like, I think there's going to be one in the Saturday paper this weekend, where we're looking at graduates from the local high schools who have gone on to interesting careers or doing interesting things.
Oh, that's fun. Yeah.
So we've had, one where I think in one issue we had two side by side where two local graduates are working for NASA in one capacity or another. One of them is a girl from Park Rapids, now a woman, I guess, who has been helping out with a research project about the atmosphere of Titan, which is the
moon of Jupiter.
It's Saturn.
Saturn.
It's a moon of Saturn. It's the largest moon in the solar system, and it's got a thick atmosphere. It's very chemically complex. It's got like organic molecules.
And she's working on
that. And then there's a guy from Nevis who's somehow involved in designing spacecraft or rovers for, like Mars lander missions and that kind of thing.
Was he a member of the Nevis robotics team?
I bet you he was. Yeah.
Okay, so you mentioned to me earlier that there had been a few sort of standout type of stories that you've actually received awards for yourself.
Yeah.
There was one where you had covered a child abuse murder, and that had an effect on you personally.
Yeah. I'm getting choked up already.
Yeah.
This was in Missouri, and I was I was pretty soon after I started working for the newspaper, and I found out, some milestone had been passed in the trial of, moving forward for the mother and her boyfriend, and of this 3-year-old boy who was essentially beaten to death by the mom's boyfriend. And they tried to cover it up and make like he had been hit by a hit-and-run driver, but it was clear that he was beaten. And and so one of the things you do when you're covering a story like that is you try to go to the official, the public record.
The paperwork.
Like the police or sheriff's office's probable cause statement. And the official complaint by the county prosecutor. And you're reading these documents and trying to get the details into the story and fairly represent what official, public sources say, they allege is happening. And the what I read about what happened to that child just wrung me out. Yeah. And I remember taking a drive in the company van just to get fresh air and, and how I'm driving around going, can I keep doing this job? I was just emotionally destroyed. And I ended up writing a column for the newspaper. As the editor, I wrote a weekly column at that time. And I just put my feelings out there. And that won an award. I think it was a Missouri Press Association award. And there was goofy stories too. Like there was a story about a bar owner who decided he wasn't going to sell liquor anymore. So he invited me down to take a picture of him and his customers pouring all their open bottles of booze out in the parking lot.
Where was this? I saw that and I was like, what? Where could that? Was that down in Missouri too?
That was down in Missouri. It was a little kind of unincorporated community called Ivy Bend, and it's kind of a poverty-stricken area. It was very isolated out in the sticks, and the bar, believe it or not, was called the Snafu. It was kind of a restaurant, but it had a bar, and the owner was kind of a character, and he was getting upset because there was open carry was allowed in Missouri, and people were coming in.
Even in bar rooms?
Yeah, they were walking into the bar with their guns on their hips and sitting on his bar stools and tearing up the upholstery. And he had all these holes in the upholstery of his bar stools, and he started thinking, I don't want people with guns in my bar under the influence of alcohol.
Well, there's one thing to permit a firearm in a eating and drinking establishment, but there's another to permit that to happen while the person's also consuming alcohol.
Yeah. I think there was ways he could have approached that other than just going out of the liquor selling business. But he decided that he didn't want to have people. I think partly it was he was just mad about the upholstery, but partly he was worried about what would happen if you put booze and guns together in the same place.
Well, yeah, that's usually a bad mix. I think you can put booze with pretty much anything else. Yeah. It's pretty much a bad mix too, but especially with firearms. I just want to get back to that first story. When you're covering crime beat and stuff like that, you're seeing a lot of stuff that you don't necessarily want to see. I know I worked as a prosecutor, and I've done criminal defense as well, working on cases, not in the criminal side, but even on the child protection side here, where you do wind up seeing some things that you can't unsee, or hearing things that you can't unhear. What kind of process do you use to kind of try to put that aside and move on, or how do you deal with that?
I guess
internally.
I guess you just have to be a professional about it,
right?
And somewhat, you also want to lean on your coworkers. Talk to your publisher. If you're an editor or a reporter, talk to your editor, and maybe come to a mutual decision. How deep are we going to plunge into this? How much of a ghoul are we going to make ourselves look like? And there have been times where I felt like my assignment is to be a ghoul, and I don't want to be a ghoul.
No.
And I, but also, where's the line between what part of the story you tell and what part of the story you hold back, because it would just be obscene.
It's gratuitous descriptions and things that people might be, sensationalistic. People wanting, I want to know that detail, but they're taking a prurient interest. That's a legal term.
And I haven't always made people happy with the decision I made that way. I mean, I remember an instance where I wrote a story about a local man. He was a landlord who was accused of taking sexual advantage of a mentally handicapped adult, a person who's a vulnerable adult, let's say, who maybe had the mental age of a child, and I went with what it said in the public record, and said, according to the police's probable cause statement, such and such happened. So and so said he did this, and then, like I said, I go to everything. At that time, if something was happening in town, if it was a dinner, I went to it, and I sat down next to some random lady, and she turned on me and said, "Everything you said about my son was a tissue of lies." And she was really angry about the coverage that we'd given to that story. It turned out to be the mother of the guy who was accused of doing this. And
it's funny you say that, because Luann had this. We were just talking about journalistic ethics, and she said that, or I don't know if it was ethics per se, but she said that she had a rule that she knew that everybody has a mother, and that their mother would be reading the story. So she said that when she was writing a story, she strove to have the mother say, at least the story was fair. Even if she didn't like it, at least it was fair.
And you try to have it, you want it to be a family newspaper that anybody in the family can read if they're reading at the level of reading the newspaper.
Right.
That it shouldn't be too offensive. So like really graphic details, even if they are in the police report, you're just going to come up with a generic term that kind of covers the whole, this whole thing.
There's an art to that.
I'm not going to point my lens at that, so to speak. I'm just going to say this happened, And sometimes the decision I make may not have been in the best of taste, but I had the most fun doing it. And I think the example that comes to mind was the story in Missouri again, where I got to write the phrase "tractor rustlers" in a headline. And
I know what a cattle rustler is, but what's a tractor rustler?
There was a ring of local yahoos that were running around abducting
I like
farm
that,
equipment.
local yahoos.
Yeah.
That's good.
They were loading other people's farm equipment onto their flatbed trailer, lowrider, truck, and taking off. And they would take it to one of their accomplices' farms and hide it behind his barn. And they were so stupid, it was ridiculous. I mean, they didn't know. It's
funny how criminals can be that way, isn't it?
I think they were under the influence of something. I mean, they didn't know what to do with this machinery. They couldn't sell it. They seemed to. They didn't really know what they were doing on anything. I think at one point they backed their trailer into the back of this guy's barn and busted up the back wall of the barn. And then they ended up freaking out and just driving everything across the county line and abandoning it on a dirt road in the next county.
Let me guess, they thought that by putting it in the other county, then they were going to be home free. Yeah. That's like the Dukes of Hazzard, right?
Just kind of lead everybody off the scent.
Yeah.
And the whole thing fell apart because they did something actually kind of grisly and cruel. It involved a cow. that met a terrible end. And it was at these guys' hands. And they were having their jollies, and the cow was didn't enjoy it. And they somehow or other, somebody reported them. Somebody was able to identify them and as the perpetrators of this cow incident. And while they were being grilled about that, the whole story about the tractors came out. And we were the ones who did this, and so and so and so and so and so and so was involved.
Yeah. Well, if you have multiple people, usually one of them will crack.
Yeah.
And then it'll start.
And I just wrote a huge story about it, and I was so happy because I thought it was the stupidest thing I'd ever heard, and I was just laughing the whole time.
Yeah. And
I think I even pitched in one of those weekly editorial columns where I just said, this is the funniest thing, isn't it? And some people didn't like my sense of humor about that. So I got a little negative feedback about the tone in which I wrote that. But,
okay.
So sometimes I don't err on the side of good taste, and that's something I have to look out for.
Right. School bullying. You did an article on that. As well. How big of a problem is school bullying here, and what did you find out by writing that article?
It's really hard to tell. It depends on who you ask. And there's a lot of people, I guess, I don't want to point fingers on anything, but it's not in the interests of the school district to disclose a lot of details about what they're seeing going on, what their discipline process is handling.
It's not in their interest, no.
So it doesn't end up being, it's not public data. They don't have to tell us, they don't have to share. So we don't really know from the school's side what is or isn't going on.
What do you hear from the parents?
And that's where it's he said, she said kind of thing, or they said, where some of the people who are coming forward are saying nobody's listening to us. We've been dealing with this for years, and our kids are really suffering, and it's affecting their health, and it's affecting their schoolwork, and nobody's doing anything to help us. Nobody believes us. And then the people right down the street are saying those people are nuts, and you shouldn't listen to anything they say. And
that's life. That there's an overlap with this profession too. I mean, it's the same. Yeah. It's the same kind of thing. Yeah.
You just put out the information you got, and again, people have to make up their own mind.
Right. The remains of an Akeley man were found.
Yes.
What I didn't quite understand when you said something about it was a link to World War II?
Yes. Neil Todd was a guy from Akeley, a graduate of Akeley High School, when there was a Akeley High School. I think class of 1937, something like that. And he and one of his brothers, Wesley, I think was his name, were both on, and I'm straining my memory here. I can't even remember what ship they were on. But it was one of the ships that sank at Pearl Harbor when the Japanese attacked.
Oh, Arizona or...
Yeah, I think it was the Oklahoma. I think it was the USS Oklahoma. And they had a high death toll on that ship. The one brother, Wesley, was able to escape with his life. And in fact, from what I hear, Wesley was on another ship that was sunk and survived that as well. He's no longer living, but he lived through being on two ships that were sunk. Can you imagine
the stories that he might be able to tell?
Yeah, I suppose if he even wanted to tell them. I think that family had something like 8 sons that all served in World War II. And
sounds like the story of Saving Private Ryan.
Yeah, kind of.
Yeah.
2 of them being on one ship that was sunk at the same time. Neil wasn't as fortunate as Wesley, and he was a casualty. And it took him until just a few years ago, to like 2019, to identify him. And
How did they do that?
I think it was one of those familial DNA things. I think I mean, he had been missing since that, Pearl Harbor, the day that shall live in infamy, but his remains hadn't been identified positively, but they had all of these remains buried in the I think they call it the punch bowl in Hawaii, and every now and then they would dig a few of them up and do some tests on them to see if they could get any closer to identifying them. Some of them would be sent home to be buried, and some of them would be reburied in the punch bowl. And he had been dug up a couple of times, and I think they came to a point in the forensic identification process where they were starting to look at relatives' DNA. And so I think one of his nephews, or maybe a surviving brother, or both, submitted DNA samples that they then compared to remains that they.
So they had a suspicion that it could have been him, and they were cooperating with that investigation.
Yeah, and I don't know if it was Neil himself or it was somebody else that I was reading about in the same group of sailors' remains, that there was a case somewhere where a person's identification was frustrated by the fact that they put him in a coffin with the wrong name on it. That I think they thought it was one person when it was somebody else, because he was a real tall guy, and that's all they knew. So they identified him as one person, and it turned out to be someone else. But whichever, I don't remember if that is actually relevant to Neil Todd, but he came home.
I was going to ask, yeah. So what became of him then?
They flew him back to the Twin Cities and then drove him up in kind of a motorcade up from the cities. And on the way, he was a firefighter on his ship, and all the fire departments between the Twin Cities and here would line the route, or they would stand on the bridges over the highway as the coffin was driven north, and salute as he went past. And there were a lot of firefighters at the funeral as well. They had the funeral at the Catholic Church in Nevis, and then they drove him out to the Akeley Cemetery and buried him, and they had a gun salute.
I was going to ask, did they do the 21 gun salute?
Yeah, they did a gun salute, firing off some long guns, and they also had a couple of flyovers by different kinds of aircraft. And I remember.
Did you attend that event?
I attended that event. I was at the funeral. They had a horse-drawn caisson carrying the coffin, and I think a naval officer with a beautiful singing voice sang a solo, and they pulled out all the stops honoring the family, the surviving relatives, and I remember one detail was when they had one of the flyovers, I was pointing my camera straight up to try to get a shot of the airplane, and I fell over backwards. Luckily on grass, but
well, I'm sure we could sit and talk about stories that you've written, for the whole entire rest of the afternoon, if not longer. But I wanted to move on just briefly before we finish to talk a little bit about music. So you're a musician yourself. You did piano and organ. How far did you go in playing, and then what sort of background do you have in composition?
Okay. Well, I did get a BA in music. I didn't specialize in any particular area of music, but just music in general, because like I said earlier, I was planning to go to the seminary, and I just needed a bachelor's degree to get into the seminary. But I love music, and I've been playing piano since I was about 8 years old, or I started taking piano lessons. And I kind of got tricked into playing the organ at my dad's church when I was about 17, or was it like a junior in high school.
How do you get tricked into playing the organ?
Well, he had a dual parish at the time, two congregations, and over by Crosby and Aiken, and the country church between Crosby and Aiken had a little parlor organ in the back of the church, and the lady who played it told me she'd like to sit with her husband for part of the service, like during the offering, and maybe a little bit of the liturgy leading up to communion or whatever. And she was like, would you just play this couple of pieces for me, and I can sit with my husband for a little while, and then I'll come back and I'll take over again. I said, sure. So I get on the organ bench, little public performance anxiety.
Oh, yeah. Well, you are looking at the interim accompanist at the First Baptist Church.
Yeah.
Right? So I know what you mean.
Yeah.
Yeah. I don't want to mess it up either.
Yeah. Well, I was a little nervous, but she did not come back to spell me at the end of the
that was where the trick came in.
Whatever segment I was supposed to do, she let me play the whole rest of the service.
Okay.
I was steaming mad. But I did well enough, and everyone's like, you should play more. So I ended up
of course they figure they find somebody they can play, then they're
So I played the organ a lot at both of my dad's churches, and when I went to college I took organ lessons, and I actually learned to play the pedals and everything. So it wasn't just my hands doing pianist stuff on the keyboard, but actually playing it like an organist would play the organ. And
did you learn Bach's Toccata and Fugue?
I think I've sight read through it a couple of times.
Yeah, I always wanted to know that was, if you knew how to play the organ, that's got to be a pretty rewarding experience to just blast that out on a big organ.
Yeah, there is a Bach prelude and fugue that I've played that I did for an organ teacher, for during when I was taking lessons in college. Where it's the one, I think it's in E minor, and it's called the wedge fugue, because the subject of the fugue kind of spreads out like a wedge.
Oh, I'm gonna have to go home and listen to that.
It's really an exciting piece of music. And it was a lot of hard work to learn to play that.
Yeah. I just on Tuesday I just was down in the cities. I saw a pianist from Iceland, Vikingur Olafsson. He played the Goldberg variations. It was amazing.
That's a great piece.
Yeah. Well, he now, and who am I to say, but he got up and said at the end of that performance that this was the greatest piece of music ever written, and there's only one bad thing about it, which is that after you play it, you simply can't play an encore. And so he thanked everybody and walked off the stage and did not play an encore. Yeah.
I've played some of that.
Yeah,
to the best of my ability on the piano at home.
If you get a chance to listen to his he's touring now in support of that recording, but just the velocity that this, unbelievable.
It takes a lot of skill, and it would take a lot of practice to get there.
Yeah, actually, I was talking to my brother about that because he and I went to it, and I said, "You think if you practice that for 20,000 hours, you could play it as well as we just heard it right there?" And he thought about it. He says, 20,000 hours is a lot of time, but I still think the answer is no. Some people just have that innate talent and ability to get through something like that.
And for me, an asset that I have as a musician is that I'm pretty good at sight reading music. So if you put the notes in front of me, I can.
That is a great asset.
I can somewhat play it.
Yeah.
But maybe not perfectly, and if it's a great piece of virtuosic music, I'm going to struggle and flounder. But and the detriment, the flip side of that is I have bad practice habits, and I think one of the, when people come up to me after I've played something that sounded really good and say, "Boy, I wish I had that kind of gift." what a talent God has given you. And it's like, well, I appreciate the talents God has given me, but I did a lot of hard work on the way to being able to play like this. And, I think, that great talent or that great gift that you think some people have but most people don't, more people could probably do that than you realize if they just worked hard enough.
Yeah.
And it's somewhat a matter of how willing you are to put in hours, years of disciplined hard work.
And I'm going to repeat one of my favorite sayings that I've come to repeat on just about every one of these podcasts now, but it was said by Ronnie Coleman, and he said, everybody wants to be a bodybuilder, but nobody wants to lift the heavy weights.
Well, I also studied voice, so I sang with the St. Louis Symphony Orchestra chorus for several years, and we actually went to Carnegie Hall a couple of times.
Oh, that's cool.
And one of the jokes that went around every time we were getting ready to go to Carnegie Hall was one guy stops another guy in the street in New York and says, "Mister, do you know the way to Carnegie Hall?" And the answer is practice, practice, practice.
That's a good one. That's a good one. I lived in New York for 14 years before I moved here. What do you call a guy who hangs out with a bunch of musicians?
A drummer.
You got it. So what would you say would be maybe your number one favorite hymn?
I have actually two or three, but it depends on what season of the church year you're in. In the Lutheran church, we observe the church year, so the Advent season, the Christmas season and stuff. And my favorite Lenten hymn is Christ the Life of All the Living. And it's got a refrain at the end of each stanza that says, "Thousands, thousands, thanks shall be, dearest Jesus, unto thee." So it's probably the best known line from that hymn.
Okay.
And, Christ the life of all the living, Christ the death of death also, and so forth. And there's also a hymn for the Christmas season by Martin Luther called "From Heaven Above to Earth I Come."
Ah, okay. I don't think I've heard that one.
It's a beautiful hymn, and it's very devotional, very devout, and like one of the stanzas, if I can remember the whole stanza, is, "Ah, dearest Jesus, holy child, make thou a bed soft, undefiled, within my heart, that it may be a quiet chamber set for thee."
Wow. I almost feel like we should end with that, but I had a few more questions. That's beautiful. Speaking of Martin Luther, so he wrote several hymns, including "A Mighty Fortress," which is most church-going people will know that hymn because it's played across denominations and things like that. Any doubt in your mind that he actually wrote the music, or was it responsible for the words, or
He actually was a composer. There's a very short piece of polyphonic music that's like music that has multiple voices that are moving around independently, and it's called "Non moriar sed vivam," I shall not die but live and tell of the works of the Lord. And it's a little 4-voice piece of polyphony that goes on for about 20 seconds, and you practically have to repeat it over and over to make it worth the time of learning it.
And he wrote that?
He wrote that, and we know of a couple of other things that he may have written the music for, but most likely the tunes of his hymns were by his contemporaries, such as a guy named Johann Walther, Walther, who published a hymnal in Luther's time that included several of Luther's original hymns. And if he didn't write the hymns, write the tunes, he got them from somewhere. Existing tunes like Gregorian chant tunes that they just kind of adapted into hymn tunes that would fit those words. And there's a famous slander on Luther that he turned pub songs or tavern songs into hymn tunes, and that's not true.
That's not true.
That's not
okay,
true.
Is that on the record? Not true.
That's not true.
Okay.
He did use bar songs, but that's a musical form or a poetic structure where you have like the syllables of the lyrics fall into a pattern with an AAB structure. That would be called a bar form.
I see. Okay, and so that's probably, what's that called when disambiguation, or there's there's a term for that where that confusion can be coming out of.
Yeah.
So you write hymns.
Yes. Yeah. As a Lutheran, I guess I'm a layman now, but I've theologically trained Lutheran layman, and I love hymnody. I love the heritage of Lutheran hymns.
How do you go? So just what's your process like for that? Like how do you start with nothing and then come up with a hymn?
Sometimes I've heard a sermon and I'm at church and the preacher just says something that's really hits me, and can I distill that down? And sometimes it'll be like at one time I went through liturgical denominations. We follow that church year that I told you about, and there's a cycle of readings for every Sunday of the church year called the lectionary.
Right.
And there's actually multiple lectionaries, and there's the historic one-year lectionary where you just repeat the same readings every year. And
every week, you mean?
No, I mean there's a different set of readings
each
week.
I see. Yeah.
But for
on this particular day, it's always the same reading.
Right. These are the readings for the third Sunday after Epiphany, and you just repeat those on an annual basis. And sometimes maybe the pastor will preach on the gospel lessons one year, and another year he'll preach on the epistle lessons, which are a different group of.
Does he always preach according to the lectionary?
I think that somewhat depends on the pastor, but a liturgical pastor will tend to stick to the lectionary.
Okay. That was a digression, but I just...
Yeah, and sometimes there'll be like multiple things that you're looking at in the same, like it's Saint so-and-so's day,
Okay.
And there's another set of readings for that. It's All Saints Day, it's Reformation Day, but it's also such and such Sunday after Trinity, and you want to look at the readings for the Sunday, or another example is Palm Sunday, which is the Sunday before Easter.
Right.
And it's also sometimes observed as Passion Sunday. And maybe on the reasoning that people aren't going to go to church on Maundy Thursday or Good Friday, they're just going to go on Sunday. And so you want to get the Passion of Jesus in there before Easter Sunday. And the suffering and death, and you want to emphasize that theme at least once before they celebrate Jesus' resurrection from the dead.
Makes sense.
And so then you have this dilemma: are we going to do the readings for Palm Sunday, or are we going to do the reading? Palm Sunday would be like Jesus riding into Jerusalem on the back of a donkey, and people are throwing down their clothes and waving palm branches and giving him, a smooth path to ride in on. And, that would be Palm Sunday. Or are we going to do the readings, the lessons for Passion Sunday?
And so you draw on this lectionary when you're going to come up with a hymn.
Yeah. And there's like our hymnal that our church uses called the Lutheran Service Book, and it has a whole section of hymns for each season of the church year, and then it goes into different topics and uses. So sometimes I'll look at the lessons for Sunday of the church year and just write a hymn based on those. So I'll look at the scripture readings and try to think, well, what's the main point I'd want to drive at if I wrote a hymn on this set of readings. Maybe.
Do your hymns like that? they sound like very like traditional church hymns when you write them.
Yeah. Although I also sometimes compose original music for them, and some of my music is a little on the modern side.
Yeah.
So
That's the praise music or the
no, more
the
like
Hillsong music or
more artsy fartsy, modern music kind of stuff.
Okay. I think that's a really interesting skill to have. I mean, we were talking about Bach and everything too, and he had that job as the Kapellmeister at a lot of different churches, and it would be his job to write original music every Sunday. And I think it's just nice to hear that that tradition is being carried on somewhat in some way. I think it's important to constantly keep new music flowing and freshen things up a bit, and it must be a very rewarding experience for you as well.
It kind of is sort of my devotions, that to me a hymn isn't quite all a hymn should be if it isn't in the Word of God. It doesn't engage with the Bible.
Right.
If it doesn't have a clear point that it's getting at, and if it doesn't pray for something.
Yeah.
And I like, or some of them are kind of teaching sort of, they adopt a tone of teaching, like hear this people, but a lot of times it's like a personal prayer. And and I've read a lot of hymns by other people, contemporary people who are writing original hymns. And I think one of the pitfalls that a lot of them fall into, especially inexperienced hymn writers, is that they take this, they adopt the posture of prayer, but they don't ask God for anything. You don't want to forget to actually ask Him for the blessing that you're seeking at that time. Take that opportunity to make a request. And another thing that maybe I'm guilty of violating is that you don't want to go on too long. Don't be too prolix. Strive to condense and to get to the point as fast as you can.
Be succinct.
Yep.
Yeah. That probably is a lesson that crosses over into both your, being a journalist as well and a writer. Well, we're almost out of time. But I'll ask you, do you have any advice for young people such as Caleb? Or do you have any advice for Caleb in particular? No, I'm just kidding.
Well, I mean, what advice regarding what would you be interested in? It's like
life advice.
Well,
avoiding mistakes.
2020 hindsight. I think if somebody asked me not too long ago, where I saw something on Facebook that asked, "What would you tell 16-year-old you?" And I think I would tell 16-year-old me to major in journalism. And I was interested in journalism from an early age, and I wrote for all the campus publications in high school and college and at the seminary, edited a couple of them, and looking back, it's like, when was I not interested in journalism? When was I not thinking about maybe being a reporter someday? Here I am, a reporter. But it really hasn't hurt me any. I mean, I got into the business, and I'm still still in the business. I think I'm doing okay as a reporter, even though I majored in music and got an MDiv.
Yeah.
Which didn't. But whatever your life experiences are, kind of gather them up and remember them, because for me as an example, every change of course that I've made, different fields of activity I've been involved in, have just made my life interesting and given me a diverse experience that I can draw on. And I know a little bit about a lot of things, and I've done a lot of cool things. I didn't even mention the time I was hanging out of a helicopter secured in place by nothing but a seatbelt to take pictures of the parade below. It's like, how many people have hung out of the open door of a helicopter,
and lived to tell about
it. Or a few years ago, the DNR guys took me out in a boat and let me help them go electro-fishing. They were...
Where's Jason Durham with you? He's told us that about this DNR electrofishing too. Yeah,
we're shocking fish and pulling them in.
Yeah, and it doesn't hurt him at all, right? That's what he said.
No, they were just kind of counting them and then letting them go.
Yeah.
And or measuring them, and so it's like everything you do, even if you only do it once or for a short period of time, becomes part of your life experience. And and I don't regret having a diverse experience, set of experiences that make my life interesting and that give me a little perspective on a lot of subjects that I end up having to write about, even if I don't necessarily come out and say in the newspaper, oh, by the way, I know all about this because for 9 months I did such and such a job.
Yeah.
But
so collect a diverse group of experiences.
Yeah, and don't regret if you have to change course. That you don't have to kick yourself for the rest of your life because you majored in the wrong thing and then changed your mind about what you wanted to do with your life. Yeah. Because that contributes to the richness of your life and adds a dimension to what you're doing now. And I don't regret majoring in music. I still play music and I still write music, and I play the organ at my church, and so it's still it's still benefiting me, and I don't regret studying theology. Although I somewhat regret the amount of money it cost compared to how long I was in the ministry. But
it's a worthwhile subject.
Yeah.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground here. I want to thank you very much. You mentioned that you think you're doing a good job as a reporter. I'd say you're doing an excellent job.
Thanks.
Speaking for myself, I don't know if everybody agrees with me, like that guy you were talking about, but you're an asset to the community, so thank you. We'd love to have you back again someday, hopefully in the future.
All right. Well, thank you.
Robin Fish, thank you. Oh, and don't forget to like and subscribe. I should have said that at the beginning, but please like and subscribe. Thank you.